Order. Matt Warman to move the motion.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered Pylons and the National Grid's Great Grid Upgrade. I want to thank the Backbench Business Committee for awarding this debate. It is a busy day in politics, as many of you will know, so I want to begin by saying that a number of colleagues have asked me to mention the work that they are doing, sharing the concerns that many of us will have here about the approach that National Grid is taking and proposals to, in many cases, I believe unnecessarily cover the landscape of some of the most beautiful parts of the country in pylons that will make permanent damage to the local economy and to the local landscape. Specifically, my neighbour in Louth and Horncastle, the member for Waveney, for Cleethorpes, for Montgomeryshire, for Sleaford and North Hykeham, for Brentwood and Ongar, and also the member for South Suffolk have all done huge amounts of work on this, and without putting words in their mouth, all share at least some of the concerns that I am going to mention today. And I also want to say that while I am grateful to my honourable friend for responding for the government, I hope that he will take back our concerns to the Policy Minister for this issue, and I'm sure that the Minister will be grateful for another meeting with this group on this important matter. Mrs Latham, I want to begin by saying that my constituents are angry. They're angry with National Grid, they're angry at the proposals, as I've said, to rewire the National Grid in such a way that uses Lincolnshire as what is frankly a dumping ground for infrastructure that could be done better and could be done differently. The proposal for a line from Grimsby to Walpole is many tens of kilometres using pylons across the country in a way that could be done underground or, even better, could in many ways be done offshore. Now, this proposal is unwelcome enough in itself, but National Grid tell us that the constraints the government put on them mean that they are required to use pylons rather than underground or offshore. National Grid also then say that the new Eastern Green Link is only viable when it is largely offshore. So the point I want to make today is that the thing that angers my constituents about this proposal and angers many of the constituents represented by colleagues here today is not simply a desire to see the local economy and the local landscape preserved from the blight of pylons. It's an anger at what feels like an incoherent strategy from National Grid. And that is set within a framework by government, and that is why I'm grateful that we have my honourable friend here today to talk about it from a government perspective. But we should, I think, also acknowledge that the way that National Grid themselves have behaved hasn't delivered the kind of transparency, hasn't made constituents feel that this is a meaningful consultation on proposals that will not be temporary, although pylons are nominally temporary. These will be with us for many years to come, and they will cost many, many millions of pounds in a way that I believe is fundamentally quite short-sighted. The longer-term view that does that very necessary rewiring of the National Grid will, I think, not benefit from an approach that doesn't take into consideration what we are seeking to achieve with projects such as Grimsby to Walpole and many others, and projects such as the Eastern Green Link bringing power down from Scotland and then to the south of the East Midlands. We should be seeking, I believe, a more coherent approach that looks at what rewiring the grid successfully for the long term will deliver. And in my conversations with National Grid, where they have talked about whether you use DC or AC, whether you use pylons or whether you use offshore or onshore, what is clear is that they have a legitimate desire proposed and originating from government to get this done quickly. And that is, I think, the right thing to do, given that we see the grid coming under very different strains from those for which it was designed. We're now, rather than bringing power out from a spine down the middle of the country, we're bringing power in from offshore. It requires a different approach. But that different approach is so fundamental, surely we cannot do it in this piecemeal way that has a number of multi-billion-pound schemes that do, where they have been reviewed in, for instance, Essex, and I know my honourable friend from Harwich will, I'm sure, talk about this as well, where they have been reviewed, it has been decided that it could be done better and in a more coherent way. So when I've spoken to many hundreds of my constituents in public meetings, on email, on social media, over a period of many months, their anger is not simply the desire to talk about the landscape. It is the desire to see a proper use of taxpayers' money, and that, to me, should always be our top priority. But I do want to talk about three of the key issues that my constituents raise above all else. And primarily, that is one of food security. Lincolnshire is one of the most productive parts of our agricultural economy. It is vital that whether it is the blight of pylons or the blight of underground cabling, which I think should be taken much more seriously, we consider how much land is going to be taken out of production by these proposals, and even the pretense that underground cabling can be remediated and then we can go back to fully productive land is a project for a number of years, and it is never, as any farmer will tell you, quite the same again. And that is why we come back to an offshore approach, I think, being our first choice. But that food security issue is a vital one either way. Secondly, constituents are deeply concerned that in an area where the two industries that matter most are agriculture, the second is tourism. And we know that many businesses have built their entire livelihoods, have bolstered the local economy by providing jobs in areas that, while they may not be technically designated as areas of outstanding natural beauty or so on, that economy is built on the landscape in which people come and stay on holiday, in which people come and spend wonderful months of the year. The approach that National Grid is taking, set by government, does not consider food security in that way. It does not consider the economic impact of what is being proposed. And thirdly, as I said at the beginning, it does not, I believe, consider what we could do if we began, not with a blank piece of paper, but with a coherent beginning approach to say, what are we seeking to achieve with a number of different projects? And I believe the reason why we have a good number of people here today for an election day debate in Westminster Hall, and a number of people saying that they would like to be here as well, is because there is real evidence, I think, up and down the country, that National Grid is not delivering the strategic approach that it should, and it is not being tasked by government to consider all of the most important issues. That is economic impact, that is food security, that is the coherent strategy that we all need to see. Now, no wonder constituents are angry when they see food security ignored, when they see economic impact ignored, when they see value for taxpayer money ignored. And we can see that there are other approaches, whether it is talking about, as I mentioned very briefly earlier, whether it is talking about an approach that uses DC cabling rather than something else, which has been found in some situations to be cheaper. We should be looking at all the options in pursuit of a coherent approach that is value for money for taxpayers. And I want to end with two second points. The first is National Grid have been holding a number of consultations across Lincolnshire on the Grimsby to Walpole project. They've been holding consultations across the country on their other projects. And one of the things they say is, how can we mitigate the impact of pylons? I have not yet met a single constituent that has said to me, I don't like these 50-metre pylons, but I'll be okay with a 40-metre one. That is not meaningful mitigation, and I think it's disingenuous to pretend that this is not going to be, on the current terms, a project of huge impact. And what I would ask the government to consider is whether that approach has been coherent, has been consistent, and whether there is a case for pausing the current set of conflicting projects and looking again at how we can make them work in a way that is better value for taxpayers and better for the grid in the long term. So that is my ask. And the one thing it would be reprehensible of me to omit here is that the Labour approach is explicitly pro-pylons. The Shadow Chancellor coming to say that pylons are the future. Well, if you wanted a demonstration of how little Labour understands rural Britain and how little Labour understands the needs of the future of the electricity grid, then there you have it. So, Mrs. Latham, I hope... I'd be delighted.
Thank you very much, Mr. Latham. On that particular point, you may note that the Welsh Labour government has actually opened a review and is instructing an advisory body, an independent advisory body, to look into the potential of underground cabling. So I would just gently point out to him that we have a far more comprehensive view of issues on this side, and perhaps he would like to acknowledge that.
This could be the first occasion when a Conservative is being asked to refer positively to Labour-run Wales. But on this occasion, I'm delighted to do so because, at the very least, a review of this process and a review of Labour policy that is, as I've said, explicitly pro-pylons is something that I would certainly welcome. Perhaps we could have unanimity across the House that we should look again at whether pylons are the right way forward and what the role of underground cabling is. But I should add, it's a rare endorsement, if it's an endorsement at all, of Labour-run Wales. To conclude, Mrs. Latham, I would simply say this. My constituents are angry. I have never had more emails, I have never had more packed public meetings on an issue such as, on any other issue than this. They don't deny that there is a real need to upgrade the grid for the future, but they want to see value for money for taxpayers, they want to see landscapes not unnecessarily blighted, and they want to see an approach that acknowledges that the economic impact and the impact on food security should be the government's coherent top priority.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend and may I congratulate him on securing this debate, which is of huge concern to many constituents across the whole of eastern England, including East Anglia. Does he share my concern? If National Grid is to bring our constituents with it, then it should be clear and open and transparent. I've had an instance in my constituency where National Grid brought a presentation to a village hall, suggesting that a certain route was a fait accompli, when it plainly wasn't. Does he agree we need more clarity, we need more transparency?
I absolutely agree with him that we need more clarity and we need more transparency from National Grid. And it is right that too many of my constituents, and by the sounds of it, his constituents, feel like this is a fait accompli. These consultations are supposed to be meaningful if they are to preserve any kind of democratic consent. And I think we all need to encourage National Grid to deliver that kind of transparency, in particular on the costings of the different options as well. So I thank him for that intervention. And to conclude, Mrs. Latham, I want simply to reiterate that point. We should think about food security, we should think about economic impact, we should think about what is best for the taxpayer when it comes to the necessary rewiring of the grid. And I would implore my honourable friend from the government to take that message back to his Secretary of State loud and clear, because that is what is in the interest of all of our constituents in this room today. Thank you.
But due to the numbers of speakers, I am going to have to reduce the limit of speaking to 4.5 minutes. And can I remind members that they should, which you are doing, Bob, if they wish to be called in the debate. And could I also request, because my hearing is not brilliant, could you face the front and not turn to other members when you respond, please? We're a hob house.
Thank you, Mrs. Latham. The demand for electricity is expected to grow. so much that in 2050 we could be using twice or nearly 3 times as much electricity as we use today. And more of our energy is now generated by offshore wind farms and solar. This means significant new infrastructure is required to connect this vast amount of cleaner energy from where it is generated to homes and businesses across the country. We have ambitious targets for more offshore wind development in the coming decades, but the grid is simply not ready for it. Now, National Grid has recognized the urgent need for investment, but their great grid upgrade must also confront the challenge of safeguarding our natural environment and, indeed, the views of our local people. The recently published UK Government State of Nature report confirmed catastrophic landscape degradation and loss of wildlife. Britain is now acknowledged to be the most nature-depleted country in Europe and one of the most damaged in the world. It is therefore imperative that alongside the modernisation of our national grid, we must prioritise the protection and preservation of our natural surroundings and indeed the amenities of our local community. It is vital that new energy initiatives bring tangible benefits to the communities in which they are located. Since 2013, the national grid has had the benefit of strategic landscape guidance from an independent panel of national stakeholders selected by the regulator Ofgem. The independent chair throughout this has been Professor Chris Baines, and I've met him on a number of occasions, and he's really inspirational in his views. His visual impact programme raised the importance of reduction to the visual impact of overhead lines in some of the most sensitive landscapes across England and Wales. Through a process of close consultation with communities, technical experts and special interest groups, National Grid and its constructors have successfully carried out major landscape engineering work and landscape restoration in several highly protected and varied landscapes. But this is not the case throughout, and this is really what we need to point out here. There is advice, there is protections, but as the grid needs to expand so rapidly, really National Grid should listen to these experts. And since I have not so much time left, I just want to add also my concerns about what National Grid is saying about the costs of onshore or offshore connections. I would like to share some of the thoughts of Suffolk Energy Action Groups, which I have also met. In their paper titled Britain's Winning Solution, they present the idea that an offshore grid could pool energy offshore and use subsea cables to transport energy closer to demand, coming onshore at brownfield sites, which can become energy super hubs. They say that this would eventually negate the need for 50% of the onshore infrastructure, namely substations and interconnectors crisscrossing the country. Carrying energy closer to demand would also help to mitigate significant costs associated with network capacity issues. The cost to consumers, which has also been mentioned from wind power's oversupply and need for curtailment payments, was estimated to be 106 million in 2020, expected by National Grid to increase to 2.5 billion per annum by 2025. This type of solution has worked already abroad, with Belgium and Denmark building more of the transition networks infrastructure offshore by creating offshore hubs than taking cabling onshore and at brownfield sites. The UK should at least consider this option. National Grid claims that this would be more expensive. It might be true in the short term. However, we must consider that this integrated approach to connecting offshore projects would significantly reduce the physical infrastructure needed to connect offshore wind farms to the grid. And may I just say, Mrs. Latham, in our transition to net zero, it is so vitally important that we are taking people with us. And if we continue this confrontational approach, we will not get to net zero in 2050 if we alienate our communities. So I urge the government to very carefully look at these solutions, and also National Grid to very carefully listen to the debate today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Latham. It's a pleasure to serve in this debate. I congratulate my honourable friend and the Backbench Business Committee for granting it. I wish we were in the main chamber, just recognising the number of speakers that we have compared to the business today that we're seeing. However, we have to make the most of the opportunity that we do. And I will just say to the Minister in his place, he's already heard a 35-minute speech from me on the 19th of March. And while I appreciate he's not the policy minister, actually being a government whip is really important to reflect in many ways the views and feelings of how the House is feeling on critical issues like this. And I know he is very astute at doing that. It's absolutely vital that we do have a reliable grid for the amount of renewable energy that this Conservative government has the ambition and the plans and the delivery in order to make sure, whether it's wind, interconnector, solar, infrastructure does need to be in the right place, not necessarily where it's just cheapest for the developer. Now, I'm very conscious that Ofgem and others have a role about in terms of energy bills, but we're talking about long-term infrastructure here, and that's why a view of how we take a sensible approach so that we make sure that it is fit for purpose is absolutely vital. And as far as I'm concerned, that needs to be closer to where the demand is going to lie. Now, Mrs. Latham, we already have Sizewell C starting to be constructed. This is not a case of not in my backyard. In fact, there is plenty of energy already in my part of the world, including wind farms and similar. But the problem now is that with the increase in the amount of infrastructure that's going to be required, we're talking about going into greenfield sites. We're talking about really complicated areas of cabling, as well as, I must admit, there aren't any new pylons currently planned in my constituency, but I know that my colleagues, whether it's the Honourable Member for South Suffolk and indeed Honourable Member for Brentwood, who've been working hard on this for their constituents. I also believe that if we were to update the technology that is being considered, that we need to make sure we could actually reduce the infrastructure, and the Honourable Member for Bath has already referred to that. I was also going to refer to Seas and Sands, the people involved in Friston and the surrounding areas, who've done extensive research on this matter, including what we could do about HVDC and the offshore platforms, as already been referred to by what the Belgians and Dutch do. Now, what I would like to say, Mrs. Latham, I'm just trying to find a quotation from somebody, sorry, is that one of the things that I'm very clear about is that OCSS should not go ahead with that plan. And the reason why is I don't believe that Sea-Link will be needed. I think if that we make sure that the connections go into established brownfield sites, and that would be Isle of Grain, potentially Tilbury, and even potentially Bradwell. And I know the Right Honourable Member for Bradwell is hoping to get a nuclear power station there with other technology in the near future. So it's already been designated and set aside for that sort of connection. And so if we were to also innovate in that regard by using more recent technology than what has been costed so far, I actually think we'd come up with a much smarter proposal that would reflect the concerns of our constituents. So that's why I'm looking to have a moratorium right now on any new connections until we have the strategic spatial plan in place, and that is due next year. And that should also have security considerations added to it. I also want to make sure we have full transparency. So publication by the NESO of their assessments and their independent reviews as well, also with comparison to current plans. I think that we should be recognising the fact that the economics stack up, such that at the moment it seems the sums only include the development. They don't include when actually the government is paying people not to put electricity into the network. And when you combine that and you start to get into the more high voltage DC, not AC onshore through the cabling, you actually come up with a cost neutral proposal. So while pylons are not affecting directly my constituency or the proposed increases, because we already have them, what I will say is that we do not need the level of infrastructure that we do. It's like a 20th century approach to a 21st century element that we need to have going forward, and that's why I strongly want to make sure our residents of Friston and elsewhere are listened to.
Yeah.
Mrs. Latham, it's a pleasure to serve with your chairmanship. And can I congratulate the member for Boston and Skegness for securing this debate. He's secured where I have failed, but I'm grateful to be able to contribute to the debate that he has led so ably this afternoon. There's no time to fall into poetic prose to describe the beauty of my constituency, Mrs. Latham, but it is known as the Garden of Wales. And the Minister is just going to have to accept my word at how beautiful Carmarthenshire is. I come from the debate where I accept climate change realities. I accept the need to increase energy security. I accept the need to improve electricity distribution in our communities, especially in rural areas. And I accept the findings of the Windsor report that we're going to need a whole lot of new infrastructure to meet those challenges. So I'm not coming from a position of political denial. However, I am facing huge upheaval in my constituency. And the reason for that is that there are now 4 proposed distribution and transmission routes being proposed for Carmarthenshire. In Roman times, Mrs Latham, all roads led to Rome. In West Wales, all pylons lead to Llanderfaelog, and the new national grid infrastructure that's been built in that part of the world, in the southern part of my constituency, which will be joining the new Llanelli constituency following boundary review. That matter, of course, is a planning matter for Carmarthenshire County Council, and all those councillors waving placards against pylon development in Carmarthenshire at the moment must use their leverage, I think, during that planning process in Carmarthenshire to try and secure some of the objectives that we have in mind. If they just bend the knee during that planning process, I'm afraid the backlash in the wards of Carmarthenshire will be quite strong, echoing the comments of the member for Boston on the anger that's in our communities at these proposals. So the 4 lines I face are the 132 Green Gen Cymru route along the Towy Valley, linking an energy generation site in Powys along down to southern Carmarthenshire. Another Green Gen route originating in Ceredigion through the Tywy Valley down to southern Carmarthenshire. A 132 National Grid electricity distribution proposed route along the Cothy Valley, and a 400 kV National Grid route linking North and South Wales. Now, National Grid electricity distribution is the recognised distribution network operator for my part of the world. However, Green Gen Cymru are in the final stages of a licence application with Ofgem to become an independent distribution network operator. When I met the umbrella organisation for the IDNOs about a year ago and explained what Green Gen Cymru were proposing, they thought I was mad. But the reality is that Ofgem are on the verge of approving an application licence for Green Gen Cymru, and there's been huge concern locally about the whole process, lack of engagement by Ofgem, and I really think this is something we're going to have to look at. I've had no opportunity to express my concerns to Ofgem in a face-to-face meeting, for instance. Now, the 132 lines now come under Welsh Government responsibility. They used to be the responsibility for the UK Government. I've had an experience with the previous line going back 12 years ago, which was dealt with the UK Infrastructure Commission. And they actually undergrounded the route along the floor of the Towy Valley following that process. And I'm glad that the Welsh Government are undertaking this study into new techniques, cable ploughing in particular. And the argument against pylons is that undergrounding is far more expensive. However, this new cable ploughing technology is extremely impressive. It can plough a line in about a kilometre a day, and it's far cheaper than traditional undergrounding costs. The undergrounding analysis is based on a Parsons Brinkerhoff IET report, which was completed in 2012. So 11 years ago, this technology is there. The largest company in Europe happens to be based in my constituency in Pencader. So I'm asking UK government ministers to engage with the work of the Welsh Government to make sure that the Welsh Government has the resource to undertake that work, because it could solve a lot of problems for the UK Government going along.
Yeah. Crosby.
Thank you, Mr. Latham. It's an honour to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to thank my friend in the Backbench Business Committee for enabling this debate. I'm speaking in this important debate on pylons and upgrades to the National Grid to give a voice to many of my Ynys constituents, like Jonathan Dean, who are concerned about the impact of pylons on Ynys and the Welsh countryside, and the impact on 2 of our most important sectors, agriculture, food security, and tourism. It's important that the planning process takes into account the impact of infrastructure on the environment and unique characteristics and vistas of Wales. It's important that we have a plan, joined up thinking, and we have transparency. It will come as no surprise that I rise to speak to the challenge of our future energy supply. After all, Ynys Mon Mam Cymru, the mother of Wales, is an energy island ready and waiting to be powered back to life. We have wind, we have wave, tidal, solar, hydrogen, and nuclear projects. We've had £4.8 million from the UK government for the Holyhead Hydrogen Hub, and the Wave Project Morlice has benefited from the UK government ring-fencing marine energy in the contract for differences allocation round. Ynys Mon's potential to supply cheap, clean power, to cut household bills and strengthen our energy security is being held up by slow upgrades to the national grid. There are enough low-carbon energy projects planned, like the Wilver nuclear site, to meet peak electricity demand 9 times over. But the grid is not being built and reinforced fast enough for developers to connect to it. Some projects are having to wait until 2038 to connect to the system, despite being ready to go. Now, of course not.
She acknowledged that really this means that developers will go away from the UK and invest in other countries, and it's a really big concern for investment in the UK on renewables.
I absolutely welcome that debate, and I welcome how important it is that we actually have developers investing in this sector. And I welcome the action the government are taking. Last year's Connections Action Plan will cut the time it takes low-carbon projects to connect to the electricity grid. The Chancellor also announced plans for a strategic spatial energy plan in the autumn budget to set out what energy infrastructure needs to be built, where and when. And closer to home, I'm proud that this Conservative government grasped the nettle and committed £160 million through Great British Nuclear to secure the Wilver site on Ynys-Môn. And if successful, this project could create 9,000 construction jobs and 900 long-term jobs and provide a source of clean, reliable energy for decades to come. I now urge the Minister to finalise the new National Planning Policy Statement for nuclear to speed up the approval process and announce the outcome of the small modular reactor competition as soon as possible. SMRs have the potential to cut the cost of nuclear, diversify our energy mix and generate steady, clean power. We must not let this opportunity pass us by. It's also thanks to the leadership of this Conservative government that we've seen the creation of the new £26 million Anglesey Freeport. With spades in the ground at Prosperity Park, the Anglesey Freeport is expected to create 13,000 new jobs and generate £1 billion of investment across the island and North Wales. The Celtic Freeport in South Wales and Teesside show the potential of freeports to boost our manufacturing base for new renewable technologies. And last year we saw the power of this net zero economy, with 74 billion in gross value added to the economy as a whole and over 765,000 people employed. The people of Anglesey are ready and waiting to play their part. Building on this model, I'd like to see the government target a new wave of business rates relief at areas with low-carbon industries that need to invest in skills training. This could create new thriving enterprise hubs across the country, like that at Menai Science Park, MSpark, and unleash a new generation of skilled workers ready to power Britain. But of course, our new power generators and the jobs they bring with them will be rendered redundant if we do not have the grid connections in place to put them to use. Where new transmission lines are needed to deliver the wind power of the Irish Sea or Ynys-Môn's new nuclear site at Wilver, it's important that developers engage with local communities and ensure that they are properly compensated for the disruption that their construction will cause. To do so, the government should extend and mandate community benefits of both transmission and generation. Last year, the Chancellor committed to giving communities the host transmission infrastructure discounts on their electricity bills of up to £10,000. And this package also included extra benefits which could be transformational for some communities, with schools and village halls refurbished, educational bursaries created, and improvements made to local healthcare provision. This is a sound investment for developers and bill payers alike. By building out the grid, we can make the whole system more efficient, reducing the waste of constraint payments in which renewable generators are paid to switch off when the system cannot cope. This could save a staggering £1 billion a year and help in the push to decarbonise our electricity supply by 2035. I'd like to end by saying, by increasing the capacity of the national grid in a way that takes into account the beauty of our countryside, especially places like Ynys-Môn, we can realise Ynys-Môn's promise as the mother of Wales, supplying clean, homegrown power to our United Kingdom. I now call on the government to give us the tools we need to do the job.
And I'd just like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Boston and Skegness for securing this debate. We on the Labour benches certainly want to see an effective and speedy transition to renewables so that we can slash energy bills, cut emissions and make progress on the way to net zero, which is so vital to stem global warming, and of course increase our energy security by not being reliant on imported gas. Now, we in Wales have fantastic resources, be that onshore and offshore wind, rooftop solar and a range of marine technologies, and we want to see them used. And it was very disappointing to see the failure last year by the UK government to get any bids for offshore wind because they had failed to listen to the industry. But, as has been noted by Welsh Government ministers and honourable members on the Welsh Affairs Committee, significant investment is needed in the national grid infrastructure to get the electricity from where it's generated to the areas of dense population and industry. Now, there is huge concern that enormous pylon projects will spoil areas of considerable natural beauty and take up space on agricultural land. And as has been mentioned by the honourable member for Carmarthen East and Dineffer, the Towy Valley is a prime site currently under consideration for these routes for the grid projects. And we are very, very keen to see that underground cabling should be considered. And as he's mentioned, part of the area will in fact be coming into the Llanelli constituency at the boundary changes. Now, undergrounding is of course perfectly possible, whether for big projects such as the gas pipe coming across West Wales, or as I've seen for myself, the use of a mole plough that can pull a plastic water pipe across a field and therefore protect the pipe, stop the water from supply from freezing. Now, there's a much more sophisticated version of that plough available, which can now use this technique for underground cabling, and that's what we do want to have considered. And I'd like to pay tribute to my Labour colleagues Martha O'Neill in Carmarthen and Jackie Jones in Ceredigion for listening to residents' concerns about pylons and taking them up with Welsh Government ministers. And I would like to draw attention to the fact that in ministerial answers, Welsh Government ministers have stated a preference for underground cabling where practicable. Of course, cost is an issue and we need much more up-to-date information. The Electricity Transmission Costing Study dates from 2012 and the Lifetime Cost Report by Western Power dates from 2014. So we do need more up-to-date information, and it's very important to do, as we've seen done by the Institute of Engineering and Technology, to look at the whole picture, the operation, the maintenance and the energy losses, and indeed, of course, things like storm damage where the overground is much more vulnerable than underground. So I think there's an awful lot more work that needs to be done in this particular area. And I'm very pleased that just a fortnight ago in the Welsh Senedd, Jeremy Miles, our new Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Energy and Welsh Language, explained that the Welsh Government will be establishing an independent advisory group on the future electricity grid for Wales, and this group will seek to build an understanding of the possible approaches and alternatives to delivering electricity transmission infrastructure across Wales, including the role of pylons and underground cabling. And I would just conclude, Mrs Latham, with saying that, yes, we do want to see a rollout of renewables, but we do want to take our communities with us. And there are ways that we can do both, that we can make sure that we do these things in a practicable way and that we have horses for courses in appropriate places and make sure that we do get the very, very best of our natural resources in the most compatible way with our community needs.
Thank you. James Wilde.
Thank you very much, Mr Latham. I join the congratulations to my honourable friend for bringing this very important debate to the House today. I'm speaking on behalf of my North West Norfolk constituents who would be adversely affected by the Grimsby to Walpole link, and also for the Eastern Green Link proposals for 2 offshore projects for the Great Grid upgrade. Great for whom is the question that many of my constituents have, as under these proposals 90 miles of a new high voltage electricity transmission line would be constructed, along with new substations, including at Walpole in my constituency near to the existing substation. It would consist of 50-metre-high pylons every 300 metres or so. Pylons half the height of the Elizabeth Tower and getting on for the height of Ely Cathedral. In addition, National Grid's consulting on 2 new offshore electricity infrastructure projects, Eastern Green Link 3 and 4, which are primarily subsea links, bringing electricity from Scotland to England. And as we increase generation from renewables, there needs to be investment to connect these sources to homes and businesses. The issue, though, is how do we do that in a way that minimises the impact on local people, on our countryside and on our communities. 3 options for the Grimsby to Walpole scheme were considered, 2 onshore and 1 subsea. The subsea option looked at a Norfolk or a Lincolnshire landfall, and there are undoubtedly challenges about a Norfolk landfall given the number of designated sites in my area, with fewer issues for a Lincolnshire solution. But they need to be assessed carefully. However, as In other areas, the default option for National Grid has been to rule out such options without proper consideration, despite the point that the visual impact, the environmental effect and disruption to communities would be far less by pursuing these options. So that needs to be revisited as this process continues. And having discounted the subsea option, National Grid's proposing nearly 100 miles of new pylons, and many constituents have raised strong concerns and objections to the preferred route, including the damaging visual impact these pylons would have on our beautiful landscapes. Much of the land on the proposed route is Grade 1 arable land, and when we're looking to improve food security, taking that out of use is going against the government intention. Pylons and substations cause noise and disturbance for local communities. The proposed area could also affect many protected sites, including the Wash, one of the most important sites in Europe. Indeed, the government has applied for UNESCO World Heritage status for the East Atlantic flyway for migratory birds, including through Norfolk and Lincolnshire, which could be threatened by the current plans. And when I met local councillors and parish councillors and parishioners, they were concerned about the location and the impact of a new large substation. They've also asked what assessment has been taken of upgrading the existing pylon infrastructure. Of course, that would need reinforcement of those pylons are there, but that would again be less intrusive and more cost-effective. And considering improvements to existing lines is a requirement of the National Planning Policy Statement, so that also needs to be addressed ahead of the next consultation. But in contrast to the Grimsby to Walpole plan, Eastern Green Links are for subsea cables with landing points on the Lincolnshire coastline. And then they would run underground for 80 miles to the proposed converter stations and a new transmission station in Walpole in West Norfolk. Yes, underground. So if the underground cable is the preferred option for this project, why not for the transmission line scheme? What scope is there for the proposed Grimsby to Walpole link to be integrated into that? Again, this needs to be looked at further. Just a word on consultation. 8 weeks is wholly inadequate given the amount of documentation that's been published and the length of time that National Grid has been working on it. And to be polite, there's been a lack of a coordinated approach with these two schemes could work better together, so we need to see a lot more of a transparent process. To conclude, there are major concerns across West Norfolk of these proposals. People are rightly opposed to the damaging impact on our communities, countryside and farmland. These plans cannot be the final answer. They must be changed.
Jamie Stone. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mrs. Latham. And can I congratulate the honourable member for Skegness and Boston. It was my pleasure to support him in going for this debate. I suspect that I'm going to speak slightly for my friend, the member for Angus, when I say that SSEN, the company, the power company, haven't exactly covered themselves in glory in the north of Scotland, or indeed in Scotland in general, because there is a feeling of hopelessness amongst my constituents. And believe you me, it's a very, very hot issue. This is just some of the emails I'm getting. Big meetings being held in places like Helmsdale, 200 people turning up. That's very unusual for people who don't normally come out on a winter's evening and are usually quite peaceable about things. So it is a bit of a mess. And the other thing is that when you say to SSEN, what are your proposals? They say, well, it's pylons. Of course it's pylons. And they produce all their maps, it's pylons. And you say, what about offshore? What about undergrounding? Well, no. Well, actually, it's the government, and we're going to go down the pylons route. And that makes us feel as if we're sleepwalking into something that we just don't want to do at all. And in the case of the north of Scotland, they are already going to put one subsea cable down the length of the east coast of Scotland, or much of that coast. So if they're putting one cable, the simple answer is, why can't you simultaneously lay two more? Why don't you just use one vessel to put the whole lot offshore? And again, when you talk about undergrounding, oh, goodness me, too expensive, dear, oh dear, oh dear. But we know about the Welsh example. We know the examples in other parts of the world where it is done. And I guess my point, Mrs. Latham, is that this is what others have said. It's a strategic decision for the UK. This is going to be about electricity for many decades to come. So we want to get it right. And it has been put to me, it's a lot easier to fix something if you get a blip in the cable, it's underground, well, you can find where it is and get down to it easy. You try fixing a cable on a mighty high pylon in the teeth of a Highland gale, It's not desperately funny, I would say to you. So I think my point is that I do wish that people didn't feel helpless in this. I do wish that the people could be taken with the project. And people are reasonable. But right now, there's a feeling it's just hopeless, we don't like it, and nobody's listening to what we say. But there is, I believe, a let-out for this. Planning powers are devolved to the Scottish Government. And to give you an example, the Scottish Government has been quite upfront about it for a number of years and said if there's any proposal to have a new nuclear power station built in Scotland, we'll call it in and we'll refuse it under planning powers. So my point is this, is I would implore the Scottish Government to realise and understand how controversial this is and to say, wait a minute, under planning powers, we're going to call it in. We're going to call it in and we're going to look at it under planning powers. I believe that could be done. And by curious coincidence, there is actually a debate right now simultaneously happening in the Scottish Parliament. Complete coincidence. And I hope and pray that the MSPs, the members of the Scottish Parliament who speak in the debate, will actually go for that pause. And I think if that courageous decision was taken to pause it, say, hang on, can we look again at this? I believe that would help our friends and colleagues in other parts of the United Kingdom. But somebody's got to take the initiative on this, because otherwise we're just sleepwalking. And when you do that, people lose faith. And if that happens, no matter what party you are, I believe it's quite dangerous for democracy. This is a strategic decision for the future. We must take people with us. And I hope that I take great comfort from the fact I think we're all singing off the same sheet. I would look forward with great interest to what the Minister has to say. I also look forward with great interest to hear what the Scottish Government has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Slater. And I chair a group of Essex, Suffolk and Norfolk MPs, some 15 of us, known as Offset. We're campaigning for an offshore electricity transmission system in place of what National Grid now call Norwich to Tilbury, to which my right honourable friend for Suffolk Coastal referred to. And I do join the congratulations to my honourable friend for Boston and Skegness for obtaining this debate. We share the objective with ESNP, which is the citizens' campaign against pylons, backed by a petition of 32,000 people across the 3 counties and growing. We all want the same, to make best use of wind power from the North Sea, maximising use of green electricity in the UK at acceptable cost by providing new capacity to get offshore wind electricity and onshore solar to consumers in London. The more we have studied these proposals, the clearer it is that present Norwich to Tilbury plans will not meet these objectives. In fact, they are against the UK national interest and should not be approved by Ofgem. I say this with no sense of blame for anybody involved. I think the Minister, his predecessors, DESNZ officials, along with National Grid Electricity Transmission and National Grid ESO and Ofgem, they are all doing their best. But the very fact that we now have a concept called holistic network design underlines the shortcomings of the piecemeal approach driven by the old regulatory regime, which has given rise to these proposals. We are delighted that the Government initiated the Offshore Coordination Support Scheme to fund studies into alternatives to the original National Grid proposal. This resulted in ESO's East Anglia Network study containing an evaluation of 10 further options for amending or improving Norwich to Tilbury. Now, the shortage of time may preclude going back to the drawing board and starting a new offshore design from scratch, but Norwich to Tilbury is already discredited and undeliverable without substantial revision. ESO's modelling still finds that the majority of proposed network designs, including all plausible options, fail to transmit the power from where it is generated to the high-demand areas, particularly to the constrained area of North London. The Government, and I've written to the Minister about this, must insist that National Grid ESO conducts further modelling to resolve the northern boundary constraints into London. ESO's option 5B from the study mentions a possible link between Tilbury and Isle of Grain, which might resolve this problem, but that is the very option which ESO has not yet modelled. Without this, Norwich to Tilbury cannot possibly be justified, and we have the data to prove it. Under all plausible scenarios, interconnectors would export this clean electricity to Europe for 80% of the time at a loss to the UK in order to avoid making constraint payments to the wind farms. This cannot possibly justify the 60 million pylons across our landscapes. And this is the main reason I oppose the new interconnector with Germany called Tarkon, which would join a new national grid East Anglian connection node near Ardleigh in my constituency. Ironically, it is this connection which causes so much environmental damage. It requires the Norwich to Tilbury project to divert to the east of Colchester by crossing the Dedham Vale Special Landscape Area and then to double back to the west parallel to the line of the A12. Even undergrounding high-voltage AC cables is hugely disruptive to the landscape and its archaeology. Tarkon would not proceed without Ofgem approved cap and floor agreement. In their press release about this, Ofgem stated, I quote, interconnectors can make energy supply cheaper, cleaner and more secure. None of these three claims apply to Tarkon. The ESO report found that Tarkon will not increase UK electricity security, even in the most extreme case. It will not help achieve net zero. In fact, our exports reduce Germany's carbon emissions, but they put ours up because we continue to rely on fossil fuels to keep the lights on in London. And it gets worse because the Arup report assumes interconnector analysis, ESO's assumes the analysis of the system constraints power will be exported even when overall UK prices are high. The constrained northern boundary into London means Tarkon is expected to export power 80% of the time, regardless of domestic prices. So what about the cost to UK electricity bill payers? The Tarkon will cost $5 billion to protect, underwritten by electricity bill payers, to protect at least $7 billion returns to the largely foreign investors. We can't allow this to proceed, and overall, the fact that HVDC undergrounding has emerged as a viable option means that the government should pause the Great National Grid upgrade. In Germany, HVDC is the default option.
Thank you, Mr. Nathan. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairwomanship, and I should also like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Boston and Skegness for securing this very important debate. For, like other colleagues, I wish to voice and relay some of the concerns of many of my constituents across Ceredigion about the proposed new pylon line, which my honourable friend Father Easton Ever referred in his remarks. And I do so by wanting to emphasise that the communities raising these concerns are communities that are not blind to the effort and the urgent need to address climate change and the efforts to decarbonise their economy. Indeed, the Welsh Government's Energy Generation in Wales report 2022, which was published last October, details the equivalent percentage of local electricity consumption met by local renewable electricity generation for each county in Wales. For Ceredigion, 118% of our local electricity consumption in 2022 was met by local renewable electricity generation. So, Mrs Latham, the community is voicing concerns about the impact of new pylon infrastructure on the environment, on the potential devaluation of their properties, and not doing so from a point of ignorance or denying the urgent need to contribute to our decarbonisation efforts. Indeed, these are communities along Ceredigion as coastline and interior valleys who have long made a contribution to these decarbonisation efforts. They are making a contribution to decarbonisation efforts, and indeed they shall continue to make a contribution to our decarbonisation efforts to the future. However, what's at heart here is this idea of a just transition, of balancing the concerns of communities with the need for new infrastructure. And although definitions of just transition differ, my understanding of the concept is that it should seek to bring about fairer outcomes from the transition to net zero by maximising the benefits of climate action and minimising the negative impacts for communities. We've heard already, Mrs Latham, in this debate, a failure to ensure this just transition exacerbates inequalities, affects support for action to address climate change and biodiversity loss, and leads to legal challenges, and ultimately can impact policy implementation. Now, this is a difficult balance to strike, or at least it was in the past. However, I'm very pleased to mention to the Minister that a solution has been found that can make things a lot easier. My honourable friend for Carmarthen East and Ever mentioned a new technique of cable ploughing. Because we all agree that the National Grid needs upgrading, it needs strengthening, and with urgency. But it is disappointing that the government has thus far failed to truly consider the benefits and advantages of cable ploughing technique by an innovative company that is based in Honourable Friend's constituency in Pencader, further down the Teifi Valley from some of the communities that are impacted by this pylon line, who have been innovative in using spider ploughing machines to really advance the way in which cable ploughing techniques can install these transmission cables, and to do so by drastically reducing the cost and time taken
to complete the infrastructure upgrade. Now, I know in the past the government has argued that undergrounding is too expensive, but this new technique actually shows that they can do so much quicker, to much less cost, and also reduce the impact on the local environment. And I think it's worth just emphasising the comparison between this cable ploughing technique and the erection of pylons. Now, one pylon company mentioned that it might take the best part of 4 months to install and to equip a single pylon tower. Compare that to the fact that ATP, which is the company in my honourable friend's constituency, when working on the Sea Green project, averaged 1.45 kilometres of cable installation per day, and that means opening, installing and closing it just by using one cable ploughing machine, to minimal environmental impact such that the land was returned to the owner the following day. Now, cable ploughing, Mrs Latham, could be a means of balancing the need for new electricity infrastructure with the importance of minimising not only financial costs but also unnecessary environmental impact and community opposition. Now, the UK government has repeatedly been asked to commission an up-to-date study to take into account these new techniques and a comparison of the costs with traditional pylon infrastructure. My ask to the Minister today is very simply, could he please agree to do so?
Yeah. Thank you, the honourable member for Boston and Skegness has done this House a service by bringing this debate to our consideration. I want in the time available to speak about three things: utility, beauty and legitimacy. T.S. Eliot said that half the harm done in the world is done by those who want to feel they're important. And such people invariably use utility to justify their claim. This must be done. There are no other options. There is no choice. This is necessary. But the truth is that very often there are competing necessities. It is necessary to think strategically about a grid fit for the future. Now, I try as a matter of a mix of good taste and good judgment to resist the arguments of Liberal Democrats. The honourable gentleman is frequently irresistible. And today the honourable lady made an excellent point about the relationship between about supply and demand. This is too rarely considered. And because it hasn't been considered enough, and I first encountered the argument when I was the Energy Minister, transmission and distribution costs have grown and grown and grown. They are roughly 15% of every electricity bill. We do need a grid that works. That is a necessity, but there are other necessities too. And in terms of utility, just let's think about the point my honourable friend made about the SSSI on the Wash, a unique habitat for migrating birds. Is that really compatible with 87 miles of 50-metre-high pylons? Of course it isn't. That is a competing necessity. Let me say a word about beauty. Those who don't know the Fens won't necessarily appreciate the glory of the open landscape, the big skies that are so often celebrated. They've never been filled by tall structures, apart from churches. Of course, churches were about God in a way that pylons could never be. So let's not fill those big skies, destroy that precious, unique landscape in this way. It would be a crime, in my judgment, to do so. Let's believe in the beauty of the Fens and the glory of our countryside, our green and pleasant land, and defend it. I hope that's what the Minister will do when he winds up this debate. National Grid don't seem concerned about that. And when challenged on cost, because cost effectiveness is, of course, important, they frequently insist that no other option is viable. The Germans are looking at just such another option. I will give way to them, given that I was so nice about her earlier.
Just very quickly, doesn't National Grid also, or should recognise that actually it increases the cost if there are all these objections, because the timelines get much longer, and that is usually where the costs increase dramatically.
Absolutely. And as the County Council have pointed out, National Grid's calculations underestimate the compensation that would be paid, the damage to the environment, all of the other additional costs associated with putting pylons on land that will be avoided if they were put it under the ocean. Yes. This is what I now gather the Welsh Government are considering. It's what the Germans have already taken as their default position. And yet we're told that pylons are the future. My goodness, that was said, I couldn't help, without meaning to be impertinent in any way, Madam Chairman, I couldn't help but laugh. because they're anything but the future. This is yesterday's approach to tomorrow's problems, if ever I've seen it. So let's glory in beauty in the way that the planning system now increasingly does. The new National Planning Policy Framework, I'm delighted to say, said that planning policy decisions could contribute to and enhance the natural and local environment by recognising the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside and the wider benefits from natural capital ecosystem services. Furthermore, the Minister of State, when I asked her particularly about the fens, said special consideration will be given to preserving the landscapes, for example, of Somerset Levels, Romney Marsh, the magnificent fens of Cambridgeshire, Lincolnshire and Norfolk. That's what we want. The third thing I said I'd speak about is legitimacy. I have a petition which I initiated in my constituency and beyond, which has already attracted 1,200 signatures against these proposals. Popular consent is essential if we're going to get the support we need for an energy policy that works. People don't want this. It is not necessary. It can be avoided, and we expect the Minister to do just that, to avoid it in the name of the people, in the name of utility, of beauty, and of legitimacy.
Thank you, Mrs. Latham. It's nice to see you in the chair, and a great many thanks to the Honourable Member for Boston and Skegness for securing this important debate. I think it's quite clear that there is a consistency around this chamber from elected members of all manner of colour of rosettes around this situation. And I will seek, as far as possible, Mrs. Latham, not to be too political in my observations, and I hope I succeed in that ambition. My constituents, like many others, are frustrated with the opacity of this dynamic. It's extremely frustrating to try and hold Scottish and Southern Energy Networks, who are the network owner and operator in the north of Scotland, where National Grid is in England and Wales, to account. Because what SSEN will, with some legitimacy, say, well, we have been tasked by the ESO to deliver this much energy down this corridor with this price envelope and to deliver it by this time. And when you crunch those numbers, you end up with pylons. So then you speak to the ESO about that frustration, and they say, oh no, we are technology agnostic. We don't care how SSEN deliver that system. That's up to them, as long as it's consistent with our delivery schedules. So there's a clear disconnect from the outset. The ESO, Mrs. Latham, have been guilty, I think, of gross complacency in anticipating that delivering this level of civil engineering across very sensitive parts of this island, and we are talking purely about GB rather than UK, that people locally will just say, well, that's okay, I don't mind pylons, just throw them up wherever you like and we'll all get on with it. It's not acceptable, it's not legitimate. And I think, and that is as distinct from the ambition to decarbonise our electricity system and for the ambitions of net zero. There is no debate about the need to transmit the electricity from where it's generated to where it's required, but it's how we do that. And we've heard a whole range of compelling arguments this afternoon about why we should be looking at alternative solutions. And I wanted to touch on just exactly some of the difficulty that my constituents in Angus are facing around this dynamic, because these are very exercised, very intelligent, very experienced people who are saying no to the prospect of pylons going through the northern opening of the big Strathmore, Mrs. Latham. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Angus, and we've heard about the Garden of Wales. I can assure you Angus is the Garden of Scotland, and Strathmore doesn't have the designation of an area of outstanding natural beauty, but I can assure you it is beautiful, and it is outstanding, and it is natural. And we already have a 275 kilovolt line coming down the Strath. We've got a prospect under the HND, ESO's holistic network design, of an additional 400 kV pylon line coming down the Strath. And we're now given to learn that under the TCSNP, nothing to do with my party, it's apparently a strategic network plan, not very strategic if you ask me, Mrs. Latham, that is an additional 400 kV line to come down the Strath. The idea that people would say, oh, but that's okay, that's fine, 3 towering lines of pylons coming down one of the most beautiful parts of Scotland. We accept that that has to be done. It's not realistic. It's not fair. It's not fair to constituents across GB that are similarly affected, and it's not fair to our collective ambitions to decarbonise our energy system, because it will undoubtedly, because of that complacency by the ESO, and goodness knows what Ofgem were doing throughout all this, because of that complacency, there will be planning appeals, there will be delays, there will be public inquiries, and where does that leave our ambitions for net zero? For context, Mrs Latham, Scotland generates 11.4 gigawatts from wind currently, today. Probably today we're actually delivering against that. And we're connected to England, where the market is largely, by a 6 gigawatt interconnector. So we can see the scale of the gap that we're talking about. This wind generation capacity that's been developed in Scotland by both the Scottish and UK governments didn't happen overnight. It's happened over 2 decades. So it's a fairly ignominious position for the UK government to find itself in, that there's such a chronic mismatch between transmission capacity and generating capacity. And that's important because the rollout of this network is a firefight. It's not being done in a planned and strategic manner with proper stakeholder engagement and management. It's being rushed through in relative terms overnight because the situation is critical. And we heard from the Right Honourable Member for Suffolk Coastal about the need to pay generators curtailment fees because you can't get their energy onto the network. That's only half of the story. We are not factoring in the cost of then switching on gas to replace that energy that you needed from wind, but you can't get to the market because of constraints on the network. And when you start to look at the gross effect of that cost build-up, you then see that you open the door to looking at more expensive infrastructure other than pylons and still having a sound business case. And that is the ambition of constituents in Angus and many other places as well. So offshoring and undergrounding need to be looked at. Offshoring in particular, in my view. These are interconnectors going from Scotland to England, and the population centres are towards the south of England. Offshoring should, in my view, be the default position until you can make a robust argument against that ambition. And this is manifold, the challenges with this, Mrs Latham. We have in Angus the very start of where you can grow seed potatoes, a tremendously important cash crop for Scotland. You can't grow them really anywhere else on GB. And they are blighted, literally, by potato cyst nematode, which goes from farm to farm. So what happens when all these construction vehicles are going from farm to farm in my part of the world and others in the north of Scotland? It's not acceptable. I listened with care to the member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross, and I accept, as an actual matter of fact, the role that Scottish Government has in planning and their ability to make a decision on that on planning. But let's not try and saddle the Scottish Government with the burden of this that's being impacted on communities. Scottish Government are just as keen as the UK Government to see this network capacity developed. But they, unlike the UK Government and its agencies, are not mandating how it should be developed. So they will take a role under planning law. I'm sure I don't need to explain that planning is quasi-judicial and you don't make a decision on the basis of how you're feeling one day. So the Scottish Government will transact that consistent with policy in Scotland. But this is not a challenge of the Scottish Government's creation. This is a challenge. Energy is reserved to the United Kingdom, to the United Kingdom Government and the United Kingdom Parliament. So this, the genesis of this challenge, it remains here at Westminster. And I want to highlight and underline, in fact, that when my constituents, and I'm sure everybody's constituents in this room, are talking about their need and their ambitions to see something more innovative, more realistic, consistent with their ambitions and the natural environment, that we have a discussion about cost-benefit analysis where the cost is not simply financial. It's about the cost to society, the cost to communities, the cost to the environment. That all needs to be factored in as well. And it's got to be understood as well that this infrastructure is disaggregated across 40 million bill payers, and then again across many decades of return on capital invested. by this infrastructure. It will last for many decades. So when you are initially confronted with a figure that's 1, 2, 3, possibly £4 billion more expensive than option A, you have to look at what that means in terms of an actual cost to an actual bill payer per year. And I'm not satisfied that that type of analysis has been done. And my constituents, and I'm sure honourable and right honourable members in this debate, are frustrated that they now have broadly the cost of the Pylon route to come through their part of this island, but they have no comparative analysis of what the undergrounding solution would be or the subsea solution would be, other than it's expensive. That kind of nebulous nonsense doesn't wash with people, Mrs Latham, and they're going to have some further detail on that. So in summary, I would urge the Minister, and incidentally I have no shortage of respect and admiration for the Honourable Member for Bolsover, but I am very disappointed that there is not a Minister from the Department here to hear this debate today, Mrs Latham. So I trust and in fact I am sure we will get a sturdy and robust response from the Minister here today, but it's a pity it wasn't one from the actual Energy and Climate Security and Net Zero Department. Thank you.
Not Latham.
Well, that's that.
Dr. Alan Whitehead.
Well, thank you, Mrs Latham, and I will be sure that I do make sure that I pronounce your name as Mrs Latham and not otherwise. And I will also, concerning previous debates, make sure I face you with our discussions this afternoon. This, I think, has been a very interesting debate, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Boston Skegness for obtaining this backbench business debate, because it has enabled, I think, us to put out on the floor this afternoon the exquisite dilemma that there is at the moment in terms of the relationship between the imperatives of what we have to do in terms of grid strengthening and grid development and management of our processes in such a way that we can ensure that all the things that we are doing for the net zero imperative can be actually managed and connected and organised in such a way that actually we do get the benefit of that renewable change for the future. And that undoubtedly means, and this is a very basic, I think, reality check, that we cannot do without a huge extension and development of our grids, both onshore and offshore, in order to bring about that benefit to the future. Not only that, it is estimated that we are going to be consuming or demanding something like 64% more electricity across our country by 2035, possibly even more than that, as the Minister points out. And that, of course, has all got to be supplied and delivered and landed. And among other things, as honourable members point out, I think it was the honourable member for Innismon pointed out, we have got to supply that additional electricity in such a way that we have a link between what it is we're producing as new, whether it's onshore, it's offshore, whether it's new nuclear, whether it's offshore wind, whether it's floating wind, whatever it is, we've actually got to make sure that firstly those things get connected up so that they can deliver the new power that they're bringing forward, and secondly that the new power can be got to where it needs to go. And we know already from other honourable members have mentioned this afternoon, we have at the moment got a huge crisis in our country of a failure to deliver the power, even where it is landed, from where it is landed to where it is needed. So we have a tremendous constraint problem as far as particularly north-south is concerned in terms of delivery of power across the country. And that is going to be potentially a huge waste of resource for the future in terms of constraining the power that is landed and comes in when it actually should be flowing down the cables to where it is needed. And I mentioned this was a serious dilemma because when we look at what are the proposals at the moment to make progress on this particular issue, and as it happens, a new publication, Beyond 2030, National Blueprint for a Decarbonised Electricity System in Great Britain, has just been published about a month ago by the energy system operator, who are, of course, not National Grid. They are the system operator that will become the independent system operator very shortly. So this is published in terms of that sort of strategic planning arrangement for the future. And we can see from that blueprint that most of what is wanted past 2030 is offshore. The bootstraps that have been mentioned in terms of dealing with those constraint issues are all offshore. The arrangements dealing with how we land offshore wind for the future are unlike what I would lay at the government's door as a bit of a blame. Unlike the point-to-point arrangements for offshore wind in the past, they are dealing with nodal collection out to sea and therefore landing at a very much smaller number of points for future. So a lot of what honourable members have said about should these arrangements be largely at sea, well, the answer is yes, they're going to be very largely at sea, and quite right too. And that's what we need to make sure we keep our eye on planning for the future. But, back to the dilemma, that can't be the case everywhere. You can't simply manage a system of new cabling where it all goes out to sea, whereas it's not landed and it's not transported across the country. So the question we've all got to solve is where those things are not out at sea, where they have to be on land, and a pretty limited number of the proposals for Beyond 2030 are in fact on land. How can we do that in the best way that, as honourable members have already said this afternoon, does take the public with us and make sure that actually we are united in recognising why we need those particular things to happen and why they are being done in conjunction with everybody else. So I am very interested in a number of observations that have been put forward this afternoon as to how we can ameliorate what it is we're putting across land when we recognise that there is an imperative to do so, taking into account all the other things that are already being done offshore. And that does mean, number one, and this is actually in the gift of government right now, it does mean, number one, to change the arrangements whereby undergrounding is always considered to be a much more costly option, simply because the full effects, as the Honourable Member for Bath has mentioned, are not taken into account. That is, the overall strategic effect of undergrounding as opposed to pylons in onshore arrangements. And certainly if we had a different way of measuring that through our permissioning systems, we'd actually be a long way to making that a much better proposition for onshore arrangements. And indeed, as the Honourable Member for Ceredigion mentions, the interesting new developments in cable ploughing, things such as that, which can actually substantially reduce the undergrounding costs for the future. So there are a number of ways, and indeed including demand-side measures, to actually see whether we actually do need quite the length of cables that we think we're going to need over the next period. there are a number of ways in which we can make that imperative much more palatable to the population as a whole for the future. What is not on the table is that we do nothing, that we don't do anything in terms of cable extensions, because that is just, as I say, back to the dilemma of the imperative. That is what we have got to get on with, and very quickly, if we are to deliver our green revolution. Yeah.
I have heard SSEN say on several occasions, well, what can we do for the community to make it more acceptable? That type of proposed deal strikes me as unacceptable. So I hope that the Honourable Member would agree that just offering something isn't really going to sort the problem at all. You know, you take the pylons and we'll do this, we'll do that. I bet we've all had that experience.
Yes, I think the Honourable Member's quite right. The idea of bunging people a few pounds to make something that is a problem, less of a problem, is not really a long-term future strategy. What we need to do is to gain, firstly, understanding, and secondly, consent for what it is we are continuing to do overground, and indeed try to integrate that with what we are doing at sea to make sure we have maximised the arrangements that can allow us all to say, well, we really have got our grid together in terms of the demands that are going to be placed upon it, but we've done that in such a way that it allows our country to work in a good way for the future as well. And I hope that is what the Minister will concentrate his thoughts on this afternoon, how we do that together.
Thank you, Mrs. Latham. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I must apologise that the Minister was unable to be here today. He was otherwise engaged. And I must indeed congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Boston and Skegness, for securing this debate. And I regret that the Minister didn't leave me his hard hat as I listened to a number of contributions from around the room. Indeed, when I was told that I was doing this debate yesterday, and in that time, my right honourable friends, the members for Louth and Horncastle, Montgomeryshire, and indeed the honourable member for South Suffolk have all contacted me about this issue. So I have some idea of the pressures that come with that particular role, and I can see that this is a particularly difficult issue for many constituents. An expanded electricity network is critical to lowering consumer bills, securing our energy supply, delivering green growth and skilled jobs, and decarbonising our electricity system. But this must be delivered in a strategic and sensitive way, which considers and mitigates the impacts on communities and on our treasured landscapes. I thank all honourable members for their contributions today. We all recognise that this is an important subject for communities. My colleagues and I are clear that community voices must be heard in our transformation of the electricity system. As the Prime Minister has made clear, we are making the change to net zero in a way that supports communities and families. This is true for new electricity infrastructure, and the organisations responsible for the planning and delivery of this infrastructure are working to deliver on this. This country is undergoing an energy revolution, one which has reducing consumer costs, respecting environmental and community considerations, and protecting national security at its core. Members here will be under no illusion that to bring new homegrown electricity onto the system, we must expand the electricity network considerably, rewiring from where the new generation is being built in our wind-rich seas and new coastal nuclear sites, and connecting it to areas of demand. We anticipate that by 2050, we will need to meet double the current level of demand, and we need an efficient, high-tech system to transport that power to drive our country forward. The government is leading efforts to speed up this network expansion to connect new generation and demand when and where it is needed. His Majesty's government is acutely mindful of the potential visual impacts of electricity transmission infrastructure, particularly overhead lines, on communities. The reinforcement of the network to transport this low-carbon electricity is being delivered through a balance of methods, including making upgrades to existing infrastructure, offshore and indeed undersea power cables. The use of undergrounding is the starting presumption in nationally designated areas, that is to say in national parks or areas of outstanding national beauty, to protect these landscapes. Elsewhere, overhead lines should be the strong starting presumption.
Given what I said about the agreement the government made to protect flat lands like the Fens in relation to onshore wind, which are much lower structures, will the government, on the grounds of consistency, add the Fens to the list you've just described?
Honourable friend for that intervention, and I'm not empowered to give that particular positive response, but he's already called on me to respect beauty throughout the debate, and I hear what he said loud and clear. And if I could finish, elsewhere, overhead lines should be the strong starting presumption, but this remains flexible, and undergrounding may be used in other areas in certain circumstances, namely where there is a high potential for widespread adverse landscapes and/or visual impacts. Such decisions will be weighed up through the planning process. The government has worked with the electricity systems operator to create a new process for strategic planning for electricity networks, which considers the 4 principles of impacts on the environment, on communities, on costs to consumers, and the deliverability and operability of this system. This design process looks at the network holistically, identifying areas where existing infrastructure should be upgraded and reinforced, and considering where coordination efficiencies or innovations like offshore cabling can be used to reduce the overall impact on communities of infrastructure expansion. New innovations in cable technology are enabling a very substantial offshore network to be created to help reduce the need for new transmission infrastructure on land. The recommendations in the ESO's most recent network plans mean that by 2035, 3 times as much undersea cabling could be laid than new pylons in Britain. However, we will inevitably require some new onshore infrastructure, as these offshore links have to make landfall and run inland. We must also consider the impacts on the marine environment and marine users, like the fisheries industry, just as we would on land, as well as the far greater costs of offshore cabling. I give way.
I respect the Minister's logic. We do have to, it's all very well to transmit it subsea. It has to come on land somewhere to find its way to the consumer base. But in the line that I'm talking about, which is going between actually Aberdeen and Carlisle, this is transmitting energy down the length or half the length of GB. That is not making landfall. That is transmitting down the land of the island. It's a different proposition and is inconsistent with his logic, is it not?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that contribution. I have to be incredibly careful when it comes to the specifics of individual projects. He will appreciate, as he mentioned in his own speech, that there is a quasi-judicial role for the Department and for the Secretary of State, so he'll forgive me if I don't comment on a specific. I recognise the concerns that communities have about energy infrastructure projects proposed in their areas, and honourable members are right to raise this issue today. This is why, at last year's autumn statement, the Chancellor announced proposals for a community benefits scheme for communities living near new transmission network infrastructure. This will see communities receive funding of £200,000 per kilometre of overhead lines in their area, £40,000 per kilometre of underground cables, and £200,000 per substation. Funding that can be decided how it is best spent locally by those communities. In addition to these generous community benefits, the Chancellor also announced that properties closest to the new transmission network infrastructure will receive electricity discounts of up to £1,000 per year for 10 years. Of course, the electricity system needs to be expanded at a scale and a pace not seen for decades, but this must be and is being done with community views at the forefront. This transformation will not only reduce household energy bills, but will foster skilled jobs and high-quality investment right across Great Britain. I once again congratulate my honourable friend for Boston and Skegness, and I'm incredibly conscious that he should have some time to finish up at the end, so I will return to the Whip's office, for where I will be silent forevermore.
So the question is that this House has considered pylons and upgrades to the national grid. As many of that are of the opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.